Thank you everyone for coming. I'm very excited to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Brent Rogers. He's the Associate Managing Historian of the Joseph Smith Papers Project. I want to quickly run down a little bit of his professional history as a historian to give you a sense of what he's been working on. He earned a bachelor's from San Diego State, a master's in public history from Cal State Sacramento, and then his Ph.D. in history from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. His dissertation, Managing Popular Sovereignty, Federalism and Empire in Utah Territory, was the winner of the 2014 Best Dissertation Award from the Mormon History Association. At his current job at the Joseph Smith Papers, he's been the co-editor of multiple volumes. Volume 3 of the Documents series, which was the winner of the Best Documentary History Book Award from the John Whitmer Association. He was an editor of Volume 3 of the Journal series, which was a 2016 Best Foreign Text publication from the Elias Publishing Professionals Association, and he was lead editor for Documents Volume 5 and the forthcoming Documents Volume 8. He's the author of a number of articles, book chapters, book reviews, and other publications online. We should note 2 award-winning articles. In 2015, an article he did for the Utah Historical Quarterly, A Distinction Between Mormons and Americans, Mormon Indian Missionaries, Federal Indian Policy in the Utah War, was the winner of the 2015 Arrington Krupa Prize for Best Article on the History of Religion in the American West from the Western History Association. And his 2015 article, The Fascinating Life of Deanna Jakes in Mormon Historical Studies, won the 2016 Best Article in Mormon Women's History Award from the Mormon History Association. You may see a trend. I was joking with him earlier if he ever tries to not win prizes for the things that he knows. And he's also one of the more modest people you'll meet, so it's easy to embarrass him with this kind of stuff. Forthcoming, he has an edited volume entitled Somewhere Between Citizens and Foreigners, Perceptions of Mormons in American Political Culture, which is under contract with Cornell University Press. And he's also working on a book tentatively entitled The Buffalo Bill and the Mormons, A History of the American West, for which he came on Red Center 9 with a fellowship to work here in the archives last year. But he's here today because his most recent book, Unpopular Sovereignty, Mormons and the Federal Management of Early Utah Territory, which was published in 2017 with the University of Nebraska Press, was the winner of the 2018 Charles Red Center Phi Alpha Theta Book Award for the best book on the American West. This is a book award administered through Phi Alpha Theta, the History Honors Society. We provide the funds for it, but we do not participate in the judging. They have their own Phi Alpha Theta committees who do so. And we were really excited when we received word that our good friend Brent Rogers had been awarded the prize. So we weren't pulling strings for a friend. He won this on the book's merit. And we should note that this year they actually split the prize between 2 books. Brent's, and the other book was Benjamin Madley's An American Genocide, the California Indian Catastrophe, who we had speak here last year. So we know how to pick the winners, apparently. So it's my personal pleasure to welcome Brent as a good friend.
Thank you.
As a scholar that I really do respect. So join me in welcoming Dr. Rogers.
Thanks, Brent. Well, thank you, Brendan, for that very kind introduction. If you know Dr. Rensink, you know he likes to build people up, and that's a very good thing. And so I really appreciate that kind introduction. Appreciate y'all for being here, and certainly for the Red Center for bringing me out today. My talk will look at Utah Territory and the politics of antebellum America. And if you've studied at all about antebellum America, you know that at that time there existed a very precarious balance of power. The balance of power between free states and slave states, the balance of power between local rights, states' rights on the one side, and federal authority on the other. And by the mid-1850s, it had not escaped the attention of American citizens that Western territories comprised a little over half of the land mass of the newly transcontinental United States. And so that's where I'd like to start in thinking about the territorial West. Territorial history matters, I guess, is the way that I'd like to start by saying this. The system of federalism in the United States, federal authority did reign supreme over the territories at that time. And federal authorities established military outposts and forts, shaped the government of the territories through the appointment of governors, judges, Indian agents, and others in the design to make these new territorial geopolitical entities into truly American places and spaces. And it was the obligation of the federal government to oversee the government of these new territories preparatory to their becoming states. So the path to statehood also ran through the federal government. So you can see that at a time when a balance of power is so important, that this great chunk of the western United States is being or is under the jurisdiction of the federal government. There's a lot of questions and problems that could potentially create, particularly as it related to the issue that is a very omnipresent issue in antebellum America, the issue of slavery. And so with the Compromise of 1850, after the United States acquired a great deal of land from Mexico after the U.S.-Mexico War, a compromise was forged in which the territories of Utah and New Mexico were created. California was brought in as a free state, and to balance out the slavery issue, the federal government made Utah and New Mexico on the basis of popular sovereignty. And so popular sovereignty was a doctrine that the people of the territories would, without federal interference, determine the nature of the government for themselves, in particular as it related to the slavery question. But this, and this is forged for a number of reasons. Part of that balance, and part of it has to go back to an 1846 congressional debate about what to do with these newly acquired territories. And this is, 1846 is before the U.S.-Mexico War has been decided, like by far. And the Congress people are already trying to decide how they're going to form these new lands. And a congressman by the name of David Wilmot from Pennsylvania submitted that no new territory acquired by the United States should be open to slavery at all. So his design, and which gained quite a bit of support from northern congressmen, was that the new territory would limit the expansion of slavery. And so that was really the question at play, the expansion of slavery. So you see that with this map, where slavery existed in those reddish pink states and then the free states. And slavery interests, of course, wanted to see the expansion of slavery into any new place. And in fact, Southern congressmen balked at Wilmot's proviso and said that if such a law was passed, that the Southern states would secede and form their own government. So 1846, this is a conversation that's already happening, raising the specter of secession very early on if slavery was to be limited in these new Western spaces. So as part of that compromise, to try to keep the interests of slavery alive and that institution's ability to expand, this idea of popular sovereignty was generated to have the potential, depending on the citizens' choices, their local will, to either vote slavery into existence or not. And so this becomes the nation's guiding principle, particularly in 1854. And so focus on this map, and if you just look, particularly if you look at Utah, New Mexico, and then when Nebraska and Kansas are brought in as territories, it's all 4 of those territories, which is a large swath of land, that are brought in under this principle of popular sovereignty. And so here's a look at some of the text of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. It being the true intent and meaning of this act not to legislate slavery into any territory or state, nor to exclude it therefore, but to leave the people thereof perfectly free to form and regulate their domestic institutions. And so this 1854 language of domestic institutions is a very interesting turning point in the issue of popular sovereignty. So popular sovereignty had always been intended as a singular solution to a singular problem of what to do about the slavery question. But domestic institutions could include a variety of things: property, family affairs, marriage, public health. All these kind of things could fit under that umbrella of domestic institutions. And we'll see in a minute why that is so important. But it really invites an unintended multiplicity into what was previously a singular problem, and raised even more and caught up even more in the rhetoric of what does the federal government have authority over in the territory anymore, or does it? In which, of course, it had and it always did from its constitutional and foundational documents about territorial law, but it doesn't put the issue at rest. In fact, it brings up and raises more questions. And Utah Territory is part of the reason why more questions are asked. And so on the ground in Utah, there's a variety of ongoing issues from the organization of the territory in 1850 up until 54 and into 1856, the presidential election that was a vital election at that time. But I'm going to go through just a couple of the issues between Utah Territory and the federal government. And so one of the big issues was the perception that Brigham Young was a despot and that he was operating a theocratic government rather than the prescribed Republican form of government, which was constitutionally mandated that all geopolitical entities in the United States operate a Republican form of government. That's republicanism, not the political party Republicans. We'll see how they play in here in just a moment. And then another major issue is Indian affairs. And Indian affairs play a vital role in Utah territorial history and in the ways in which Washington, D.C. Observed Utah territory. Mormons were believed to be making alliances with Native peoples against the government. These are evidences from Utah's federal Indian agents would send reports back to Washington stating that Mormons had violated the 1834 Trade and Intercourse Act, as it was called, which was a guiding principle of Indian policy in the United States, that specifically, Mormon teachings were alienating Great Basin Native peoples from the interests of the federal government. And it wasn't just one Indian agent that wrote about it, although one in particular named Garland Hurt was a catalyst. But also in 1854, a group of the Federal Army came through Utah for a time, and its leading figure, and I don't remember his rank offhand, but his name was Edward Steptoe, also wrote back to his superiors in Washington, speaking about the ways in which Mormons were attempting to ally themselves with Native peoples against the interests of the government. And so these evidences, whether they were real or perceived, added up in the filing cabinets of those in the White House. And presidential cabinets held on to those. And then the last issue is the issue of plural marriage, which is kind of so if the theocratic form of government and Indian affairs are kind of the things that are underneath the surface, plural marriage is is really front and center and being talked about quite a bit. Plural marriage is viewed very negatively by Americans for a variety of reasons, but one of the reasons that they saw is that men practicing plural marriage were barbarous peoples and therefore unfit or incapable of governing themselves. And so, and the other thing is you have on the other side, Mormons claim the right to practice this according to local will and local desire based on the popular sovereignty language. Mormons embrace popular sovereignty not so much because of its results for what that might mean for slavery interests in the West, but for their own purposes in perpetuating a familial institution that was much different from the rest of the United States. And so that brings us to the pivotal 1856 presidential election, in which presidential politics and territorial policies and the system of the territories really took center stage. And so a main plank of the Democratic platform was that the Democrats would follow the principles contained in the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This was, to them, the only sound and safe solution to the slavery question that continued to face the United States. So they're for popular sovereignty, in other words. Well, the newly formed Republican, and this is the capital R Republican Party, this is the first presidential election that the newly formed Republicans participated in, and this is when we call the Republicans today the Grand Old Party. This is where it begins, and a main plank of their platform was that the Constitution confers upon Congress sovereign powers over the territories of the United States for their government, and that is legally the case. And that in the exercise of this power, it is both the right and the imperative duty of Congress to prohibit in the territories the twin relics of barbarism, polygamy and slavery. And so polygamy here is referring specifically to Utah Territory. It's the only known territory in which plural marriage is being practiced. And then the tying it to the slavery aspect is truly an absolutely brilliant political rhetorical device, because now these two institutions, one of which roughly half the nation wants to see expanded, and the other of which no one in the nation wanted to see exist in the United States, are now inextricably linked together. And so here's I think this political cartoon is really fascinating, and I don't know if you can see here, and there are other things that are going on in the election. The Kansas issue is also a territorial issue, but when you have polygamy and slavery right here, and James Buchanan, the Democratic nominee, is trying to hold himself as well as the rest of the nation, represented by all of those balls there. The question that the Republicans and others are trying to raise is, can James Buchanan hold up the nation on a platform that would protect and support the existence of both polygamy and slavery in the Western territories? It was, like I said, I think this is a pretty brilliant thing. Although it doesn't ultimately work for the Republicans, Buchanan still wins the election, but not with immense wide-ranging support. But Buchanan is savvy enough to know that he can't leave the territorial issue alone. And he talks, again, he's trying to move away from slavery and polygamy and just refocus the conversation on slavery. And he says that nothing can be fairer than to leave the people of a territory free from all foreign interference to decide their own destiny for themselves. So again, he's falling back on that popular sovereignty idea, that local will, local rights to make their own choices about their government, and that if the nation can move away from this and just say, okay, we're going to let the people of the territories decide their destiny for themselves, it will be most happy for the country, because then we can move beyond this issue that has been a sticking point and very sticky for some time. And so he really doubles down on this idea. And this is something I found a number of years back, but the New York Times had done word clouds of all the presidential inaugural addresses, and so you can see in highlights some of the key things that Buchanan talked about with territory, slavery, power, things of that nature. And so with him doubling down on popular sovereignty, when he gets into office, there's still issues at play in the West that he's going to have to deal with, right? He can't just say, oh, we're going to go hands off of everything. And part of what he finds immediately is reports and letters and the arrival of some federal officials in Washington talking about the disgraceful, they call it, state of affairs in Utah. So one of the letters that the White House receives is from John F. Kinney, who was the Chief Justice of Utah Territory at the time. And he said that the Mormons were inimical to the U.S. government and that, quote, they send out men for the ostensible purpose of converting the Indians, but really to poison their minds against the government and Americans, and also to make them their allies in case of any difficulty with the United States, end quote. And so with this and a lot of other evidence that had been accumulated by the previous administrations that got passed on to Buchanan's White House once he was elected, you have a growing sense among the cabinet that something needs to be done. Federal officers are unable to do their jobs in Utah, and so therefore the proper governing of the territory in an American way is not being accomplished. And so here's a couple of quotes from cabinet members. John B. Floyd, which is, if you look at the circle of cabinet members there, he's immediately to Buchanan's, I guess, looking at you would be his right. He's got his hand in his, anyway. He said, this people have claimed the right to detach themselves from the binding obligations of the laws which govern the communities where they chance to live. They have substituted for the laws of the land a theocracy. So again, that comes back to that idea of there is not a republican form of government being run in the territory. And then Jacob Thompson, along with this letter from John F. Kinney, talked about all of the evidences he'd seen of Native Americans allying with Mormon peoples against the interests of the United States. And both of these men, and then others, including the Attorney General, advocated using military force to restore the supremacy of the Constitution and federal laws in the territory. And so just a couple of months after Buchanan is inaugurated, he makes the decision to send about a quarter. The estimates range whether it's a quarter or a fifth of the U.S. Army, but it was approximately 2,500 troops to Utah Territory to put down what they later say is a Mormon rebellion. That's why I have supposed there, right? So there's the decision. So I'll come back to this a little bit later, but the decision is made in late May, and we don't hear from Buchanan about his decision until December. And a lot of things have transpired between those months that are important to note. But Buchanan observed that there was a lack of federal authority, a lack of federal presence and infrastructure necessary in the territory to properly govern the peoples of Utah. And so he made what was a very legitimate decision to send an army out to correct this territory in the way it was being governed. But the popular sovereignty ideals of non-interference and sending a federal force that is quite large don't really square. And so that's where we come to what does this mean about national discourse and how the rest of the nation is seeing Utah and why it's important. So Utah had been in the discourse, right, with the twin relics, the 1856 election, but it was at roughly the same time that James Buchanan made his decision to send the army that Stephen A. Douglas, who was probably the most prominent proponent of popular sovereignty and local will that there was in the United States at the time, a very powerful senator from Illinois. He was the chairperson of the committee, Senate Committee on the Territories. So he obviously has a lot of sway over territorial decision making. He makes a speech in June of 1857 about popular sovereignty in the territories. And among the things that he said, he called Mormons alien enemies and unfit for the government in the United States. And he called the people of Utah a loathsome and disgusting ulcer that needed to be cut out of the nation's body politic. And he too advocates a very resolute federal hand. He wants to see the government repeal totally the Utah Territorial Organic Act and reconstitute that land under a different auspice, whether it's several territories or what. He doesn't exactly say in that speech, but that is kind of a nuclear option for the government, right? To say but it also shows how much authority the government's had over the territories of the West, that they could repeal that, remove it as an entity, and then reconstitute it under a different way of governing. Like I said, whether that's multiple territories or what. And so this is raising as many questions as it answered for this idea of political autonomy in the territories. And the person that called Douglas to the carpet and called him out for it more than just about anyone was Abraham Lincoln, who about 2 weeks after Douglas gave his speech in Springfield, Illinois, gives his own speech in Springfield about the Western territories. So he wants to know a couple of things. He wants to know why this senator who's been promoting non-interference and the popular will for so long is now saying that we should promote strong federal power over this one particular Western territory, but not the others. And of course, Lincoln, as a Republican, understood and wanted to see Congress and federal authority reign supreme over the territories and shape those territories in the way that they saw fit. But forcing federal over local will did not sit well in terms of the rhetorical device that proponents of popular sovereignty often used. And so this is what Abraham Lincoln asked. And he said, to be sure, it would be a considerable backing down by Judge Douglas from his much vaunted doctrine of self-government for the territories. There is nothing in the United States Constitution or law against polygamy. And again, he's reframing it back to that discussion of plural marriage so that they could tie those two twin relics back together. And why is it not a part of the judge's sacred right of self-government for the people to have it, or rather to keep it, if they choose? And then he goes on to say, I thought the sacred right of squatter sovereignty secured to every people the right of the people to live as they pleased. So now why deprive them of this fundamental right? And so he's pointing out a very evident now inconsistency in the logic behind popular sovereignty and local will. And that inconsistency is that it was created for and designed for slavery interests. And now that there's other domestic institutions at play, there's not this neat little package of, oh yeah, we have a policy by which we can ferret out the slavery question or the slavery issue. Now we have a new domestic institution to grapple with, so it can't be a one-size-fits-all policy. And so following Lincoln's address, you have newspapers across the country going, even ones that were Democratic leaning, that kind of like light bulb went off in the head a little bit of, wow, yeah, there is a real inconsistency here about what the balance of power means. Is it really in the hands of the people of the territories, which they had hoped for and thought before, or is it like the foundational policies regarding territorial governance were, and that it's in the hands of the federal government? And it presented an almost irrefutable logic. If you extend from the Republican platform of 1856 in that rhetoric to this, even the Utah War and the president's decision to send an army to Utah, the same federal power that could be used over one territory for one domestic institution can be used over another territory for another domestic institution. And so that question of power balance becomes even murkier than it had been before. And so one thing to point out is, I remember I was talking to a scholar about this once, and he's like, well, but James Buchanan never said anything about polygamy when he made the decision. And that's true. No documentation exists that shows James Buchanan sending the army to Utah to crush out plural marriage. But I'll just present a couple of cartoons, and then there's a vast array of evidence that everybody thought it was a war to end polygamy. So here's a Harper's Weekly image, and this is after news that the army was being sent to Utah. And both of these illustrations have to do in different ways with plural marriage. So this one is Brigadier General Bombshell of the Mormon Army before leaving his house to exterminate the ruthless invaders from the States, confides the care of his 27 wives to Chief Brother Young. And then the other one is Major Bayonet of the Mormon Irregulars. And it says, in a rash moment, decided to give to each of his wives a lock of his hair. And now you see that he's bald, so he's, it's kind of the idea that he's got so many wives and not enough hair to pass around. So these are just two illustrations of several that you could find in which that's what people associated the army action with. So it wasn't enough for Buchanan to try to separate the two in his speakings about Utah. Other people just naturally assumed that it was about plural marriage. And here's another one in which it's suggesting that Mormon men weren't, quote unquote, man enough to fight their own battles, and that they would have a larger number of women to fight the battle for them, and so they arm them and send them out to war. And so again, that notion about plural marriage. So here's just a couple of handsome guys. We'll go into this. So Mormons largely believed in their right to local sovereignty, local self-government. Right? I mentioned that they really bought into and believed in in popular sovereignty, and they defended that ability. They defended their right to govern themselves. Orson Pratt presented the argument in the same way as actually that James Buchanan had, and that to undertake to deprive the people of one domestic institution, you can deprive all others upon the same principle. So again, he's trying to point out the flaws of the democratic decision to use federal force in Utah. And while he's making those arguments, Brigham Young is issuing martial law, making a proclamation of martial law in the territory. And so here's what he says in his part of what he says in his martial law declaration. He says, "Our duty to ourselves, to our families, requires us not to tamely submit to be driven and slain without an attempt to preserve ourselves. Our duty to our country, our holy religion, our God, to freedom and liberty requires that we should not quietly stand still and see those fetters forging around, which are calculated to enslave and bring us in subjection to an unlawful military despotism, such as can only emanate from usurpation, tyranny, and oppression. And so his rhetoric, in a lot of ways, can be read as very American rhetoric, right? He and his people see the coming of the army as a tyrannical and oppressive movement, and to eliminate their rights to self-government. And this again is a thinking that kind of dates back to revolutionary times, in this idea that not having military law over a group of people and enforcing federal authority in these ways is not appropriate in the United States. That was sort of the argument there. And so you can kind of get from this sense to see both sides of the story, how Mormons were thinking about the issue and how they're seeing the balance of power, and how the federal government is seeing it, because they don't think that proper American governance is going on in the territory. And so it's a difference of opinion in terms of how power is being used. So James Buchanan, like I said earlier, he issues his first public remarks in his annual message to Congress on December 8, 1857. This is the first discussion he has about the Utah War. And so one of the things that he argues for is that they're reclaiming and restoring the supremacy of the Constitution and federal law in the territory. And then one of the things that one of the things that he mentions is that Brigham Young issuing martial law was proof that a Republican form of government did not exist in the territory, and instead that the Mormon leader had a dictatorial thirst for power, and that the martial law effort was his attempt to maintain that power. And so you can see that, again, this idea of power and the power struggle comes into play again. And so this is the thing I was mentioning, like the convenience of Buchanan not having any public discourse about Utah until much after the war had initiated, and Brigham Young's response kind of plays right into it. And so it's in that first annual message and in other places that Buchanan, in later places, Buchanan talks about the rebelliousness of the Mormon people, and he points specifically to the martial law declaration. So it's like, is it rebellion, or is it rebellion after the fact? And regardless, it's being used as a justification. The fact of the matter is there was a need that James Buchanan and his cabinet saw to extend and promote federal authority and infrastructure in the territory, regardless of rebelliousness. It's just that rebelliousness gives a nice justification for the sending of a federal army in this time of contention over the balance of local will versus federal authority. And another big thing that Buchanan highlights in his annual message about Utah is Indian affairs. And this has really been a focal point of federal administrations in the West, and would continue to be. And that as superintendent of Indian affairs, he's focusing on Brigham Young here. He had the opportunity of tampering with the Indian tribes and exciting their hostile feelings against the United States. And so this matches with perceptions, the continued perceptions of a Mormon-Indian alliance. It also matches the idea and the evidences that the White House had received about what was going on in Utah. And so this is a cartoon about the defiant attitude of Mormons and Native Americans against the government in kind of a farcical cartoon here. No one's sailing up the Great Salt Lake to fight against this Mormon-Indian alliance, but it makes the point, right? And then just to bring this one back, there's also this sort of racialization of Brigham Young here as chief of the Mormon people, and he's been styled and presented more as a Native American figure. Buchanan's later other messages after the Utah War had been ongoing, and as he's trying to promote the positive impact of the Utah War, he notes that the Army has been able to have a powerful effect on and correct that idea of a Mormon-Indian alliance, to separate the two, suppress Indian hostilities, and that the Utah War, ultimately, what it's going to do and what it means is that it will, an establishment of a federal infrastructure in the form of military posts and new routes that would encourage settlement in this Great Basin and encourage American interests in the area. So the troops go through Salt Lake City and establish a couple of new forts, and a new military department is created in Washington. And so here's where James Buchanan really shows his pleasure and positivity. He tries to make this a very positive thing, this positive outcome of a growing federal presence and federal strength in the Great Basin. That is, that new military department. There's 2 new forts. Soldiers in the area are developing new routes, creating the one group led by Captain Simpson makes a new route from Salt Lake to San Francisco that cuts off 200 miles. That's significant, very significant for the time when overland trail was the main mode of transportation. So it creates better and facilitates better movement of peoples and goods into Utah. Scientific explorations, they get to know more federal knowledge of the land. And then just an overall surveillance of the peoples in the Great Basin is strengthened by this movement. And that's both Native peoples and Mormon peoples. So I circled on this. This is a kind of a busy map, but you can see Fort Bridger there and Camp Floyd across from Provo. Those are the 2 military installations, and there's the route of the Simpson expedition going there in 1859. And so these are positive results. The development of a military district around Camp Floyd has a positive result. Same with the Fort Bridger military district. The surveillance of Native peoples in the area, and then the overall presence of federal authority. And like I said, that facilitation of communication, movement of people's protection and settlement, these are benefits for the public interest and private interest. And so this is really, if you look at the whole of the U.S. Army's involvement in Western expansion, this is what they're doing in other places. And so it's kind of an extension of federal policy in Army exploration to make these spaces that have been acquired by the government truly American, and then with the Great Basin to make now a truly transcontinental American nation. So just to kind of conclude here, historians have long seen the Utah War as Buchanan's blunder, and Buchanan has had definitely a tough presidency, a lot of missteps, and a lot of times the Buchanan's blunder is about the prosecution of the war and the ways in which the military operated. But it can also be looked at as a very much a political misstep when it comes to the popular sovereignty debates and to that balance of power of federal and local will. But the good news is that James Buchanan has announced on Twitter that he is going to run for president of the United States again. I guess he'll come back from the dead under the slogan, "Make America Break Again." So whoever runs the James Buchanan Twitter feed is very savvy in making fun of the president, who is often seen as one of the worst presidents of all time. But apparently perhaps he won't always be seen that way. And then here's another one. When you're a real adult, when you're able to destroy the Union. I just put these in because everyone's needs a little humor at the end of long presentation like this. But just some concluding thoughts that the federal government's efforts to establish national sovereignty in Utah undermined the democratic policy of popular sovereignty, and that events as they unfolded in Utah revealed a truly fundamental flaw of localist philosophy in the United States at the time, and particularly with the territorial system that had been in play. And while there are far-reaching ramifications of enforcing a civil Republican form of government with military force that had been seen in the Utah War, questions about federal power, and combining that with the existence and question of whether slavery would expand that were ultimately determined with the Civil War, the specter of those questions and the power behind them were raised significantly. And so when you look at it like that, you see the effect of Utah, but then you can also see this territorial period and James Buchanan's role in its history as part of a broader effort for the federal government to extend a Republican form of government and federal authority over Indian affairs and federal infrastructural development in the West. And so these are just some of the reasons why I think that understanding Utah and the multiplicities and multiple effects of power plays and power dynamics in the Antebellum West is both fascinating and important for us to study Utah and its place in American history. And with that, I thank you for your attendance and willingness to listen to me. Thanks.
If anybody needs to leave for class, we can give you a second to move out, but we do have some time for Q&A with Dr. Rogers.
There are kind of two elements to my question, which has to do with sort of the connection, the historical connections between, say, the sovereign citizen movement and what you're dealing with historically. I do think that the sovereign citizen movement probably has its own folk history of these ideas and how they extend from it. And I'm curious what you think about those connections, but also sort of like how you see this notion of popular sovereignty playing out, I guess, in a more dispassionate historical account of if there's a continuity between the notion of popular sovereignty and, say, the claims of the sovereign citizen movement now. I'm talking about like the Bundys and the, cattle ranching activism and so on.
Yeah, interesting. I guess I can't claim to know a whole lot about the more current sovereign citizen. I mean, I know the basic tenets of it, and I think the basic tenets kind of do match, right? Like, who has the authority and why are the questions that kind of undergird both of these. And I do see some parallels in the ways in which, especially with Utah Territory, early Mormon settlers are trying to govern themselves, protect themselves, ensure their own rights and things like that, and want to use this general notion of popular sovereignty to their advantage in a way that I think still exists, right? People want to see local, the various levels of American federalism play to their own advantage, and don't want to see a strong presence in some distant place, which it doesn't feel as distant to us today, right? Washington D.C. doesn't feel as distant today, but essentially it's people not of the people making decisions for the people, if that makes sense, and that to a lot of people doesn't match with what they think that American republicanism should be. So I do think that there's a bit of a continuity there, and I don't know that that's fully addressing your question, but
I'm interested in whether or not this notion is so sort of culturally ingrained in, for lack of a better term, the ancestral tradition of cattle ranching, that there really is sort of a clear line between the debates that you're talking about in the 1850s and whether that ideology of popular sovereignty was so prescient that it really was sort of in the cultural fabric, such that the Bundys, that's kind of been their family tradition, or whether it's something that people are sort of rediscovering and saying, hey, fighting the same fight they were fighting.
Yeah, and I guess I don't know fully, but I do think that the seeds of this date way back to American Revolution, right? The idea of people across the sea shouldn't, I know I'm starting to quote the Hamilton musical, but shouldn't regulate the price of tea, right? I mean, like people in distant lands shouldn't be making decisions for the people that live in different spaces. That's part of where American ideals about government come from is in that same period. And I do think that those seeds were planted then and prop up and sprout up every so often. Yeah.
Well, and it's a debate about sort of a Lockean notion of property that goes back to the beginning of America, which is that nobody can own the commons, and so the federal government can't claim ownership over the commons until you mix your labor with it. What you can own is your labor, and so when you improve land, then you can claim to own it. And so both the Bundys and the Mormons are coming in and saying, the federal government doesn't own this land. This is basically free land in the commons, and by improving it, we make it ours. And that's why Brigham Young initially resists government surveyors coming in with Gunnison in 1853. It's because he's afraid the government is going to sort of map out all this property and lay claim to it and make the Mormons pay for it to occupy it. And so he's sort of trying to occupy as much territory as he can, as much land as he can, before the federal government has a chance to lay claim to it. I think the Bundys very much are in that tradition.
Yeah. Yeah, great point. Any other questions?
So did Buchanan ever respond to the criticisms of his administration on the popular sovereignty level, saying, no, what we're doing in Utah in terms of military action there does not betray the notion of popular sovereignty?
Not that I've seen. I have not seen him directly address it. I think in the ways in which he, at whatever level, is giving the commands to the army, which I think are light. He's and in his presidential pardon. So he pardons the Mormons after the army arrives in 1858, and basically says, "Oh, you're pardoned from all rebellious activities and things like this." And so those are, I think, implicit in his trying to disconnect the two, but he never, at least nothing that I've seen in his writings and in his papers, that directly addresses the issue. So, but I do think there's a bit of an implied, he sees the problem that he's sort of created, and so if we can focus it on this idea of a rebellious place, and then offer a pardon for the rebelliousness, that skirts around the issue a little bit more. Yeah.
I got a two-part question. So you have this idea of if a Democratic president can use the federal army to put down a domestic institution, what's to stop a Republican administration from doing the same thing, right? But against slavery, like how explicit was that? The precedent that was being set there, were they explicitly saying, hey, this could be used in the opposite direction? And then when it eventually is used, is there an explicit discussion, like harkening back to the Utah War?
Yeah, great question. So there is in newspaper editorials, and it's primarily where I think I've seen it, but also, like I mentioned that quote from Orson Pratt. He's saying basically that same thing, but newspaper editors across the country are picking up on this after Abraham Lincoln's speech in Springfield, and they're explicitly saying that very thing, right? Now, in terms of what that means for later on, I don't think I've seen anything that points back to the Utah War as like see, we knew this was going to happen kind of thing. But that in 1862, Abraham Lincoln signs into law laws outlawing slavery and polygamy in the territories. This is, of course, after the Civil War has already commenced, but really does tie that back together again in sort of an implicit way. All right.
Well, thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you all for coming. Appreciate it.